Emma had always loved her quaint suburban neighborhood. The tree-lined streets, the well-kept lawns, and the sense of community made it the perfect place to raise her two young children. She had moved in 6 months ago, eager to start fresh after her divorce. Her next-door neighbor, Mr. Williams, was an elderly man who had lived there for decades. He was friendly enough, always greeting her with a wave, though he rarely left his house. One evening, after putting her children to bed, Emma sat down to relax with a book. As she read, she noticed a flicker of movement outside her living room window. She peered through the blinds and saw Mr. Williams standing in his yard, staring at her house. He stood motionless, his face obscured by the shadows. A shiver ran down Emma's spine. She told herself it was nothing, probably just an old man taking a walk. But as the days passed, she began to notice Mr. Williams watching her more frequently. He would stand in his yard or at his window, always looking in her direction. The unease grew, but she didn't want to cause a fuss over what might be innocent behavior. One night, she heard a strange noise coming from the backyard. It was a soft rustling, followed by a faint tapping at the back door. Emma's heart raced as she crept downstairs, her phone in hand, ready to call the police. She peeked through the window and saw Mr. Williams standing at her back door, his eyes wide and wild. "Emma, please," he whispered urgently. "Let me in. They're coming." Fear gripped her, and she dialed 911. Mr. Williams continued to plead, his voice growing more frantic. "You don't understand. They're coming for us. We need to get out of here." The police arrived within minutes, and Mr. Williams was taken away, muttering about unseen threats and danger. Emma felt a wave of relief wash over her. She hoped that was the end of it. A few weeks after the incident, a new family moved into Mr. Williams's house. The Carters were a young couple with a baby on the way. Emma introduced herself and welcomed them to the neighborhood. They seemed friendly and normal, which put her at ease. Life returned to its usual routine until one evening, Emma noticed something strange. As she took out the trash, she saw a figure standing at the Carters' window, looking out at her house. It was Mrs. Carter, her face pale and expressionless. Emma waved, but there was no response. The next morning, she decided to check on them. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. As she turned to leave, she heard a faint cry from inside. Worried, she tried the door and found it unlocked. She stepped inside, calling out, "Mrs. Carter, are you okay?" The house was eerily quiet. Emma followed the sound of the crying to the nursery. She found Mrs. Carter sitting in a rocking chair, staring blankly at the wall. The baby, red-faced and wailing, lay in the crib. "Mrs. Carter," Emma said softly, touching her shoulder. Mrs. Carter turned slowly, her eyes empty and distant. "They told me," she whispered. "They told me the truth." Emma felt a chill. "Who told you? What's going on?" Mrs. Carter's expression shifted to one of sheer terror. "They come at night. They watch us. They want our baby." Emma backed away, her mind racing. She took the baby and hurried outside, calling the police again. When they arrived, they found Mr. Carter in a similar state, mumbling about watchers and shadows. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma began researching the neighborhood's history. She discovered a series of mysterious disappearances dating back decades, all involving residents of her street. Each family had reported seeing figures watching them before they vanished. She dug deeper and found a disturbing legend. The land her neighborhood was built on was once home to a cult that practiced dark rituals. The cult believed they could gain eternal life by consuming the souls of the innocent. When the town grew and the cult was driven out, they vowed to return and reclaim their territory. Emma realized with horror that the Watchers were the spirits of the cult members, still hunting for souls to sustain them. They had latched onto the families, driving them to madness and despair. That night, Emma prepared to face the Watchers. She armed herself with salt, iron, and other protective items she had read about. As darkness fell, she felt their presence, cold, oppressive, and malevolent. She stood her ground in the living room, chanting a banishing spell she had found in an old book. The temperature dropped and shadows moved around her, whispering threats and curses. But Emma held firm, her voice steady and strong. Suddenly the shadows recoiled, shrieking in anger. One by one, they dissipated, leaving the room feeling lighter, the air warmer. Emma collapsed to her knees, exhausted but victorious. The next day, the neighborhood felt different. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and the Carters began to recover. their memories of the past weeks fuzzy and unclear. Emma knew she had done the right thing, though she would never forget the terror of those nights. She vowed to protect her children and her home, always vigilant against the darkness that lurked just beyond the edge of normal life. The Watchers were gone, but Emma knew there were always other dangers, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sarah had always believed her neighborhood was the epitome of safety and tranquility. The tree-lined streets, friendly faces, and the comforting routine of suburban life made her feel secure. She and her husband Tom had moved into their new home 3 months ago, excited to start their family. Everything seemed perfect until they met their neighbor, Mr. Langley. Mr. Langley was a middle-aged man who lived alone in the house next door. At first, he appeared polite, if somewhat reserved. He rarely engaged in conversation beyond the usual pleasantries. However, Sarah began to notice strange things about him. He would stand at his window, staring into their yard for hours. Occasionally, she would catch him watching their house in the dead of night. One evening, as Sarah was gardening, Mr. Langley approached her. His sudden appearance startled her, but she forced a smile. "Hello, Mr. Langley," she greeted him. "How are you?" He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on her. "Good evening, Sarah. Nice weather we're having." "Yes, it is," she replied, feeling uneasy under his intense gaze. "Your garden is coming along nicely," he said, his voice low and flat. "Thank you," Sarah said, glancing at her watch. "I should get inside now. Dinner is almost ready." Mr. Langley nodded again and walked away without another word. Sarah watched him go, a shiver running down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. As the weeks went by, Sarah's unease grew. She started noticing more odd behaviors. She would find small items moved in her yard, garden tools misplaced, and once a footprint in the flower bed that didn't belong to her or Tom. Sarah confided in Tom, but he brushed it off, saying Mr. Langley was just a lonely old man. One night, Sarah was home alone while Tom was on a business trip. She was watching TV when she heard a noise outside. It was a faint scraping sound, like someone was trying to open a window. Her heart pounded as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. The operator assured her that a patrol car was on its way. Sarah crept to the front door, peeking through the peephole. She saw Mr. Langley standing in her yard, his face partially hidden in the shadows. He was holding something in his hand, but she couldn't make out what it was. The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights illuminating the street. Mr. Langley stood still as the officers approached him. Sarah watched from the window, her fear turning to confusion as she saw Mr. Langley calmly speak to the officers. After a brief conversation, they let him go, and he returned to his house. An officer knocked on Sarah's door, and she opened it cautiously. "Ma'am, we've spoken to your neighbor. He said he was just checking on your house because he heard a noise," the officer explained. Sarah frowned. "But he's the one making the noise. He was trying to get in." The officer nodded sympathetically. "We'll keep an eye on the situation, but there's nothing we can do right now. If you feel unsafe, don't hesitate to call us again." Feeling frustrated and unnerved, Sarah thanked the officer and locked all the doors and windows. She spent a restless night jumping at every sound. The next morning, Sarah decided to do some research on Mr. Langley. She went to the local library and looked up old newspapers and public records. What she found made her blood run cold. Years ago, Mr. Langley had been a suspect in the disappearance of a young woman in the neighborhood. The case was never solved, and he was never charged due to lack of evidence. But the details were chillingly familiar. Accounts of strange noises, items moved, and the feeling of being watched. Armed with this information, Sarah went to the police station. She spoke to a detective, showing him what she had found. The detective agreed to reopen the case and put Mr. Langley under surveillance. Over the next few days, Sarah noticed an increased police presence in the neighborhood. Mr. Langley seemed to be aware of it too, as he became even more reclusive. Then, one night, Sarah heard a commotion outside. She peeked through the window and saw police officers surrounding Mr. Langley's house. They arrested him on charges related to the old case, as new evidence had surfaced linking him to the disappearance. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear as she watched him being taken away in handcuffs. With Mr. Langley gone, the neighborhood slowly returned to its peaceful routine. But Sarah would never forget the weeks of living next to a predator, the constant fear and the eerie feeling of being watched. She learned to trust her instincts and remain vigilant, knowing that sometimes the biggest threats come from those closest to us. Julia had always loved her cozy apartment in the city. It was close to her job, had a great view of the park, and she had friendly neighbors. Most notably, Mrs. Hamilton, a sweet elderly woman who lived directly across the hall. Mrs. Hamilton was like a grandmother to Julia, often bringing her homemade cookies and chatting about the good old days. However, everything changed when Mrs. Hamilton's health started to decline. Her son, Richard, moved in to take care of her. At first, Richard seemed like a considerate and dutiful son. He was polite to Julia and always seemed to be around to help his mother. But soon, Julia began to notice odd things. Late at night, she would hear strange noises coming from Mrs. Hamilton's apartment, muffled conversations, the sound of furniture being moved, and occasionally, what sounded like crying. Julia tried to brush it off, thinking it was just her imagination or the normal sounds of an old building. One evening, Julia ran into Mrs. Hamilton in the hallway. The elderly woman looked pale and frail, more so than usual. "Mrs. Hamilton, are you okay?" Julia asked, concerned. Mrs. Hamilton glanced nervously at her door. "I'm fine, dear. Just a bit tired. Is there anything I can do for you? Anything you need?" Mrs. Hamilton hesitated, then shook her head. "No, no. Thank you, Julia. You're very kind." As Mrs. Hamilton shuffled back into her apartment, Julia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She decided to keep a closer eye on the situation. Over the next few weeks, the noises continued, and Mrs. Hamilton seemed to grow more withdrawn. Julia started noticing bruises on the elderly woman's arms and a haunted look in her eyes. When she mentioned her concerns to Richard, he brushed them off, insisting that his mother was just old and clumsy. One night, Julia was woken by a loud crash from across the hall. She rushed to her door and peeked through the peephole. She saw Richard dragging something heavy down the hallway, a large black bag. Her heart pounded as she realized it was the same bag she had seen Mrs. Hamilton use for her laundry. Unable to contain her anxiety, Julia called the police. She explained her suspicions and the strange noises she had been hearing. The dispatcher assured her that officers would be sent to check it out. When the police arrived, they knocked on Mrs. Hamilton's door. Richard answered, looking calm and collected. He invited the officers in, and after a few minutes, they left, seemingly satisfied. The next morning, Julia saw Richard in the hallway. "Why did you call the police, Julia?" he asked, his tone accusatory. "I heard noises. I was worried about Mrs. Hamilton," she replied, trying to stay calm. "She's fine. You shouldn't involve yourself in things you don't understand." Julia nodded, but her concern only grew. She decided to visit Mrs. Hamilton the next day, bringing a small bouquet of flowers. When Richard answered the door, she insisted on seeing the elderly woman. Richard reluctantly let her in. Mrs. Hamilton was sitting in her favorite chair, looking weaker than ever. She smiled faintly at Julia. "These are for you," Julia said, handing her the flowers. "Thank you, dear. They're lovely," Mrs. Hamilton replied, her voice barely above a whisper. As Julia sat with her, she noticed Mrs. Hamilton's hands were trembling. She leaned in and whispered, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Tears welled up in Mrs. Hamilton's eyes, but she shook her head ever so slightly. Richard hovered nearby, watching them closely. Julia left feeling more helpless than ever. She needed to find a way to help Mrs. Hamilton without putting her in more danger. She decided to start documenting everything, the noises, the bruises, and Richard's behavior. She also reached out to Adult Protective Services, explaining the situation and her fears. A few days later, a social worker visited Mrs. Hamilton's apartment. Richard tried to block them from entering, but they insisted. After a thorough inspection and a private conversation with Mrs. Hamilton, they decided to remove her from the apartment for her safety. Richard was furious, shouting at the social worker and Julia, who watched from her doorway. The police arrived again, this time arresting Richard for elder abuse, after the social worker found sufficient evidence of his mistreatment. Mrs. Hamilton was taken to a care facility where she could be looked after properly. Julia visited her often, bringing flowers and cookies and helping her adjust to her new environment. As the weeks passed, Mrs. Hamilton began to regain her strength and her spirit. Julia's apartment felt safer again, and she was relieved that Mrs. Hamilton was no longer in harm's way. The ordeal had left its mark, but it also brought the neighbors closer together as they all rallied around to support Mrs. Hamilton. Julia learned a valuable lesson about vigilance and the importance of looking out for those who might be vulnerable. She knew that the quiet, friendly facade of a neighborhood could sometimes hide dark secrets, and she vowed to always be there for her neighbors, just as she had been for Mrs. Hamilton. Like the video if you enjoyed, and subscribe for more horror stories.